The envelope arrived marked Secret Medical Directive in red ink, delivered by armed military police days before the largest invasion in history. Inside, orders that had nothing to do with tactics or enemy positions. Orders about what soldiers could not do with their own bodies, 72 hours before combat. Orders that carried the death penalty. As Captain John Roberts read the directive, one question burned through everything else. What kind of military science would risk thousands of lives to control something this personal? March 1944 marked the convergence of 2 million Allied soldiers across southern England, transforming quiet farming villages into sprawling military staging areas where American, British and Canadian forces prepared for an invasion that would determine the outcome of the Second World War. Captain John Roberts commanded Company C of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, stationed near Portsmouth, where his men conducted amphibious assault training in conditions that claimed more lives during practice runs than some actual battles, drowning in frigid waters, weighed down by 60-pound packs while trying to scramble up fortified beaches under simulated machine gun fire. His company consisted of 192 men, most between 19 and 24 years old, including 3 veteran sergeants who had survived North Africa and Sicily and whose combat experience represented the difference between organized assault and chaotic slaughter on beaches that intelligence reports warned would be the most heavily defended shoreline in human history. Roberts carried more than just the tactical responsibility for his men's survival during the upcoming invasion that Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had code-named Operation Overlord. His younger brother Daniel had been killed at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia 15 months earlier, cut down by German machine gun fire during the first major American engagement against Wehrmacht forces, and Roberts had personally written to their mother explaining how command failures and inadequate training had sent inexperienced troops into a massacre that could have been prevented. The guilt of surviving when his brother had not drove Roberts to train his company with obsessive attention to detail, running beach assault drills until men collapsed from exhaustion, memorizing every man's strengths and weaknesses, and building a unit cohesion that military efficiency experts said was impossible to achieve in less than 18 months of continuous service together. His 3 sergeants, Michael Dawson, Frank Kowalski, and Robert Chen, represented the combat-experienced backbone that would keep scared teenagers alive when they hit Omaha Beach, and Roberts knew that losing any of them would cost lives he could calculate with disturbing precision. The sealed envelope arrived at 0600 hours on March 28th, delivered by military police courier directly to Roberts' tent at the Portsmouth staging area, where final preparations consumed every waking hour before the scheduled invasion window. Roberts opened the document marked Secret Medical Directive 57-44. And read instructions that defied every principle of military common sense he had learned in 3 years of active service. The directive prohibited any sexual contact for 72 hours prior to combat operations, citing physiological studies that claimed sexual activity reduced testosterone levels, decreased aggression response, impaired decision-making under stress, and compromise the killer instinct necessary for successful offensive operations against fortified positions. The order applied to all personnel scheduled for assault wave assignments and carried penalties, including immediate removal from combat duty, reduction in rank, court-martial proceedings, and, in cases of deliberate disobedience during wartime, possible execution for conduct prejudicial to military effectiveness. Roberts spent 2 hours trying to reach battalion command for clarification, only to receive confirmation that Medical Directive 57 had been approved at the highest levels of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force based on confidential research obtained through intelligence channels. The directive had been implemented across all units designated for first wave assault, affecting approximately 35,000 troops who would hit the beaches in the initial hour of the invasion. Command clarified that compliance was mandatory, that military police would conduct spot inspections at civilian establishments known for prostitution, and that unit commanders bore personal responsibility for enforcing the regulation within their companies, with the same rigor applied to weapons maintenance and tactical readiness protocols. The problem materialized at 2300 hours that same night, when military police detained 3 men from Company C outside a French refugee boarding house in Portsmouth that operated as an underground brothel serving Allied soldiers who faced probable death within weeks. Sergeants Dawson, Kowalski, and Chen sat in holding cells, awaiting Roberts' decision on their fate. The military police report stated clear violation of Medical Directive 57. Roberts had 72 hours to process the charges. The invasion window opened in 96 hours. His 3 most experienced combat leaders faced removal from assault duty. Their replacements would be 20-year-old corporals with 0 combat experience. Roberts calculated the death toll difference. The numbers made him sick. He had to choose between following orders and saving lives. But the directive came from Supreme Headquarters. Disobeying meant his own court-martial. Possibly execution. The math was brutal. 3 sergeants or 300 dead privates, orders or conscience, military law or combat reality. Dawn approached fast. He needed to decide now. Roberts walked into the holding facility at 0200 hours, carrying the service records of his 3 sergeants and a growing suspicion that Medical Directive 57 represented something far more dangerous than bureaucratic overreach. Sergeant Michael Dawson had earned a Silver Star at Kasserine Pass for holding a position that allowed 200 men to retreat under covering fire, then fought his way back through German lines with 3 bullet wounds that should have killed him. Sergeant Frank Kowalski had survived the entire Sicily campaign, including the brutal house-to-house fighting in Gela, where his platoon suffered 70% casualties, and he possessed an instinctive understanding of German defensive tactics that had saved dozens of lives during subsequent engagements. Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who faced constant discrimination despite his combat record, had single-handedly destroyed 2 German machine gun nests at Salerno and carried 4 wounded men to safety under mortar fire, earning a battlefield commission recommendation that the army rejected based solely on his ethnicity before reducing him back to sergeant when command realized they could not function without his tactical expertise. The military police captain, who processed the arrests, a rear echelon officer named Harold Benson, who had never seen combat, and whose primary concern involved enforcing regulations rather than understanding their battlefield implications, explained that Medical Directive 57 had been distributed to all provost marshal units with orders to conduct aggressive enforcement operations at known houses of prostitution within 10 miles of embarkation points. Captain Benson showed Roberts the arrest log from the previous 72 hours, which documented 147 soldiers detained for violating the directive, including officers up to the rank of major, with processing paperwork that would remove them from combat assignments, pending court-martial proceedings that typically required 6 to 8 weeks to adjudicate. Roberts recognized names of platoon leaders and company commanders from other units in the 1st Infantry Division, men whose absence from the invasion would cascade into catastrophic leadership gaps that training manuals warned could transform organized assaults into suicidal charges against fortified positions defended by experienced Wehrmacht troops who had spent 4 years perfecting coastal defense techniques. Roberts demanded to see the complete text of Medical Directive 57, including its scientific justification and the command authority that authorized its implementation across the entire invasion force. Captain Benson initially refused, citing classification protocols, but Roberts invoked his right as commanding officer to review any directive that affected his unit's combat readiness, a regulation that superseded classification restrictions when operational effectiveness stood in question. The complete document arrived 90 minutes later, delivered by courier from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, and Roberts spent the next hour reading 37 pages of pseudoscientific research that cited testosterone studies conducted at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology in Berlin between 1938 and 1941, the same institution that provided medical justification for Nazi eugenics programs and conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners that violated every principle of medical ethics established since the Hippocratic Oath. The directive's appendix contained a captured German military document translated from the original text, outlining experiments conducted on Wehrmacht soldiers before the invasion of France in 1940 that measured combat aggression levels, decision-making speed, and wound tolerance in soldiers who had engaged in sexual activity within 72 hours of combat operations compared to control groups who had not. The Nazi research claimed statistically significant decreases in all measured categories among soldiers who had recent sexual contact, though Roberts noticed the methodology section described control measures that included administering amphetamines to the abstinent group while withholding them from the sexually active group, rendering the entire study scientifically worthless and medically fraudulent. Someone at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had taken this Nazi propaganda, removed the obviously criminal methodology, repackaged it as legitimate military science, and implemented it as binding policy that would strip the invasion force of experienced combat leaders at the precise moment their expertise became most critical to mission success and soldier survival. Roberts confronted Captain Benson with the document's origins and demanded to know who had authorized implementing Nazi medical research as Allied military policy. Benson deflected, stating that directive origins were above his authority level, but confirmed that enforcement came directly from the office of the Supreme Commander, with explicit instructions that compliance was non-negotiable regardless of operational impact. Roberts pressed harder, asking whether Benson understood that executing this directive would kill Allied soldiers by removing experienced leaders and replacing them with untested personnel. Benson responded that military discipline required following orders, even when individual judgment questioned their wisdom, and that the chain of command existed precisely to prevent subordinate officers from substituting personal opinion for strategic directives issued by commanders with access to intelligence that field officers could not evaluate. Roberts left the holding facility at 0400 hours. His sergeants remained in custody. The directive stood enforced. Supreme Headquarters had implemented Nazi science. His men would hit Omaha Beach without their best leaders. Command had ordered him to process court-martial paperwork. Instead, Roberts headed to the communications tent. He needed to reach someone above Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, someone who understood what this directive actually meant, someone with authority to stop it. But the invasion clock was ticking. 90 hours remained, 3 days to save his sergeants. 3 days to prevent a massacre. 3 days to fight his own command structure. The radio operator looked up as Roberts entered. Time to break every protocol he had ever learned. The communications tent operated under blackout conditions, with 3 radio operators managing encrypted traffic between Portsmouth staging areas and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, located in Southwick House, 15 miles north. A constant stream of tactical updates, logistical reports, and classified intelligence that coordinated the movements of over 2 million personnel, preparing for an invasion that had already been postponed twice due to weather conditions and equipment failures. Roberts entered without announcing himself and approached Corporal James Martinez, a signals specialist who had served under him in North Africa and who understood that certain communications required unofficial channels that bypassed standard protocol when lives hung in the balance. Roberts explained the situation in under 3 minutes. Nazi medical research implemented as Allied policy, experienced sergeants detained for violating pseudoscientific orders, invasion force being stripped of combat leadership at the worst possible moment, and Supreme Headquarters refusing to acknowledge the operational catastrophe unfolding across every embarkation point in southern England, where military police continued arresting soldiers whose only crime involved seeking human connection before probable death. Martinez confirmed what Roberts suspected. Similar inquiries had flooded communications channels from battalion and regimental commanders across all invasion divisions, creating a coordinated protest that Supreme Headquarters had responded to by issuing direct orders prohibiting further discussion of Medical Directive 57 and threatening court-martial for any officer who questioned the policy through official channels. The directive had generated more internal resistance than any order issued since the beginning of the war, with field commanders unanimously recognizing the tactical insanity of removing experienced personnel for violations of a regulation based on discredited enemy research. Martinez showed Roberts a classified memo circulated among senior communications staff that revealed the directive's true origins. British intelligence had captured the Nazi medical documents during a raid on Wehrmacht headquarters in Tunisia, and an American military psychiatrist named Colonel Lawrence Thornton had advocated for implementing similar policies based on his belief that sexual restraint enhanced military discipline and warrior mentality, convincing Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower's medical staff that the research methodology, while questionable, identified genuine physiological effects that warranted preventive measures during critical operations. Roberts demanded access to Colonel Thornton's personnel file and discovered that the psychiatrist had never served in combat, had spent the entire war conducting research at military hospitals in England, and had published multiple papers before the war advocating for sexual regulation as a tool of social control, including proposals to criminalize extramarital relations among military personnel regardless of combat status. Thornton's academic credentials came from the University of Vienna, where he had studied under physicians later recruited into the Nazi medical establishment, and his pre-war writings expressed admiration for German approaches to racial hygiene and population management that Roberts recognized as barely disguised eugenics advocacy repackaged as military psychology. The directive represented not battlefield necessity, but ideological obsession, implemented by a man whose theories had found no acceptance in civilian medicine, but who exploited wartime authority to enforce beliefs that peacetime oversight would have rejected as dangerous pseudoscience divorced from combat reality. Roberts composed an urgent message addressed to General Omar Bradley, commanding general of 1st United States Army, and the officer directly responsible for American forces designated for Omaha Beach, explaining that Medical Directive 57 was decimating combat leadership across assault units and requesting immediate suspension pending review of its scientific foundation and operational impact. Martinez encrypted the message and transmitted it through priority channels that guaranteed delivery within 30 minutes. The response arrived in 45 minutes. General Bradley acknowledged concerns, but stated that the directive came from Supreme Headquarters with General Eisenhower's explicit approval. that theatre commanders lacked authority to countermand medical policies established at the strategic level, and that individual unit commanders must enforce all regulations regardless of personal disagreement, while pursuing concerns through proper channels which currently remained closed due to operational security protocols. Roberts sat in the communications tent as dawn broke over Portsmouth, the eastern sky turning from black to grey, while landing craft practiced beach approaches in the harbour below, where thousands of soldiers prepared to die in an invasion that might fail because military leadership valued sexual morality over combat effectiveness. He had exhausted official channels. His sergeants remained imprisoned, 86 hours until invasion. Colonel Thornton was the key, the man who convinced Supreme Headquarters to implement Nazi research, the man whose theories would kill Allied soldiers. Roberts needed to find him, confront him directly, force him to see what his directive actually meant. Martinez pulled Thornton's location from personnel databases, Southwick House, medical section, 12 miles away. Roberts stood, grabbed his service pistol. Time for unofficial channels. Southwick House stood 3 stories above manicured gardens that concealed the underground command center, where General Eisenhower and his staff coordinated every aspect of Operation Overlord, transforming a Georgian manor into the nerve center of an invasion that would commit 156,000 troops to beaches defended by 50,000 German soldiers, backed by artillery, mines, and 4 years of fortification engineering. Roberts arrived at 0700 hours and bypassed security checkpoints by showing movement orders marked urgent, walking through corridors filled with intelligence officers, logistics coordinators, and medical staff who prepared casualty estimates that predicted 30,000 Allied deaths in the first 24 hours if weather and tactical execution failed to match optimistic projections. He found Colonel Lawrence Thornton in a third-floor office, reviewing reports from military police units documenting arrests under Medical Directive 57. A thin man in his early 50s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression of clinical detachment that Roberts recognized from doctors who treated wounded soldiers as statistical data rather than human beings whose screams echoed through field hospitals. Thornton looked up from his paperwork as Roberts entered without knocking, and immediately adopted a tone of bureaucratic authority designed to establish hierarchy and discourage confrontation. Roberts closed the door and placed Thornton's complete academic record on the desk, including his Vienna education, his pre-war publications advocating sexual regulation as social control, and the captured Nazi documents that formed the supposed scientific foundation for Medical Directive 57. Thornton's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation as he realized Roberts had assembled evidence that exposed the directive not as legitimate military medicine, but as ideological enforcement disguised as combat readiness protocol. Roberts spoke quietly and precisely, explaining that he commanded 192 soldiers preparing to assault the most heavily defended beach in Europe, that 3 of his most experienced sergeants sat in holding cells for violating a regulation based on fraudulent Nazi research, and that Thornton's directive was systematically stripping the invasion force of combat leadership that could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure measured in thousands of unnecessary American deaths. Colonel Thornton responded with the calm certainty of a man who believed his theories transcended battlefield reality and conventional military wisdom. He explained that modern warfare required not just tactical skill, but moral discipline, that soldiers who indulged base appetites before combat demonstrated weakness of character that compromised unit cohesion and fighting spirit, and that the Nazi research, while methodologically flawed, identified genuine principles about human psychology and physiological readiness that transcended political ideology. Thornton claimed that military leadership had grown too permissive, that the American soldier lacked the martial discipline of his German counterpart, and that regulations like Medical Directive 57 represented necessary correctives that would transform a conscript army into an elite fighting force worthy of the European theatre. He cited historical examples from Spartan warriors to Napoleonic soldiers, claiming that sexual restraint before battle had been recognized across civilizations as essential to martial effectiveness, and that modern military psychology simply provided scientific validation for ancient wisdom that contemporary permissiveness had foolishly abandoned. Roberts listened to Thornton's justifications and recognized the fundamental disconnect between ideological theory and combat truth that killed soldiers when academic fantasies encountered battlefield reality. He explained that he had watched men die in North Africa because inexperienced officers made textbook decisions that ignored terrain, enemy positions, and the brutal physics of machine gun fire raking across open ground. He described holding his brother Daniel as he bled out from wounds that could have been prevented if command had valued combat experience over rank seniority. He detailed how Sergeant Dawson had saved 200 men through instinctive tactical decisions that no training manual could teach and no regulation could quantify. Roberts placed photographs on Thornton's desk, showing the faces of 19-year-old privates in Company C who would die on Omaha Beach if they lost their experienced sergeants, asking Thornton whether his theories about sexual restraint and moral discipline would comfort their mothers when casualty notifications arrived, explaining that their sons had been killed because the Army removed veteran combat leaders 72 hours before the largest invasion in history. Thornton remained unmoved, stating that individual casualties, while regrettable, were subordinate to establishing proper military discipline, and that Roberts' emotional appeals demonstrated exactly the kind of permissive thinking that weakened American martial culture. Roberts stood and drew his service pistol, not pointing it at Thornton, but placing it on the desk between them, explaining that he faced an impossible choice: follow regulations that would kill his men, or violate direct orders and face court-martial or execution for conduct prejudicial to military discipline during wartime. He told Thornton that he was returning to Portsmouth to release his 3 sergeants and falsify the arrest reports, that he was willing to face any consequences after the invasion, and that if Thornton attempted to stop him or alert military police, Roberts would ensure that every war correspondent, every member of Congress, and every military investigation board would know that Medical Directive 57 was based on Nazi eugenics research implemented by a psychiatrist who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Roberts left Southwick House at 0800 hours. Thornton made no move to stop him. The threat worked. 82 hours until invasion. Roberts drove back to Portsmouth and walked into the holding facility where Captain Benson processed paperwork that would remove 3 combat veterans from the assault force. Roberts ordered immediate release, citing procedural errors in arrest documentation. Benson protested. Roberts invoked emergency command authority. The sergeants walked free. Roberts falsified reports stating they had been detained for unrelated minor infractions. He distributed them back to their platoons. Company C was whole again. The paperwork would catch up eventually. Court-martial would follow. But his men would hit Omaha Beach with their best leaders. The math worked now. On June 6, 1944, at 0630 hours, Company C landed in the second assault wave. Sergeants Dawson, Kowalski, and Chen led their men through murderous fire. 73 soldiers from Company C survived the beach. Without those 3 sergeants, Casualty estimates predicted fewer than 20 would have made it past the waterline. Roberts was court-martialed in August, reduced in rank, dishonorably discharged. His men testified on his behalf, explained what he had saved. The verdict stood. Medical Directive 57 was quietly rescinded in September 1944. No official explanation given. Colonel Thornton retired in 1945. No disciplinary action. Roberts died in 1998. His funeral included 73 veterans, men who owed their lives to a captain who chose soldiers over regulations.